All right. Thank you all for tuning in to our inaugural event for the Fall Speaker Series. We have with us tonight John Medaille, who will be giving a lecture on culture and capitalism, the triumph of distributism. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat, and we will be answering those at the end of John's talk. And with that, I will hand it over to John. John, go ahead.
Bill, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who's here. I really appreciate this opportunity. I don't think I need to recount, at least for anybody in this audience, how at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, two English thinkers, Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton, pondering the economic tragedy that was the 18th and 19th centuries in England, called for a restoration of property, a restoration of property to the common man and the ordinary English citizen. And they raised this challenge to the dominant liberal culture just at the moment when that culture was at the zenith of its power. That is to say, they raised their challenge at the very moment when it seemed least likely to succeed. But what I think is less well understood is that distributism was part and parcel of a much wider challenge to the liberal world order, a challenge that originated in many different sectors of society, all at the same time. Indeed, the 20th century was largely a working out of some of these challenges, many of which failed, especially in the political and economic orders. Challenges such as communism, fascism, and Nazism. And they failed precisely because they were not really challenges at all, but extensions of the dominant liberalism. But in their place, other challengers have succeeded, and succeeded in areas as different as physics, religion, economics, and politics. And among the winning challengers, we can count distributism, even if not under that name, for the name itself is a problem. More about this problem of a name a little later. It should be obvious, I think, that all political and economic discussion takes place within the limits of a dominant metaphor. And if one is challenging those limits, it is a good idea to understand just what the limits are and just how they came to be. And if someone is attempting to change these limits, it is crucial to understand just how they change. What I will attempt to do in this talk is to briefly describe how we got to a civilization dominated by the metaphors of modernism. Then I wish to recount why the metaphors of modernism have not and cannot produce a realistic economic science or a sustainable economic order. And finally, I will attempt to show how these metaphors are changing and that the model of science is shifting once again, and distributism, in one form or another, is gaining ground and becoming widespread within the modern world. Every society, every culture operates under certain assumptions that it takes for granted and which guide all political, social, and cultural acts. These assumptions normally appear in the form of an overriding metaphor, which everyone, or nearly, regards as true or given, and are expressed in their foundational stories, legends, and myths, which recount in symbolic and narrative forms the underlying assumptions of that culture and civilization. The overriding metaphor in all pre-modern civilizations was that the world was an organism filled with life. Growth was the norm, but growth into a form typical for that particular organism. And all of the organisms were part of one divine organism. Central to the metaphor was the great chain of being, in which everything, starting with the lowest and seemingly most inconsequential, was connected in a hierarchy, and the hierarchy which always led to the divine. Every tree, every plant, the rivers, the oceans, the mountains, all had their guiding spirits, spirits which had to be at least respected and perhaps even appeased. Being, existence, was not something apart from life. Rather, life was at the heart of being. The cultural task was to bring the social order into harmony with this living universe and to guide our lives and our societies and according to its natural rhythms. All of this is to say that the model was organic and the universe a living organism. In the Christian version of this metaphor, man had dominion over nature, but it was the dominion of a father over a family, with the purpose of allowing each person, family, and community to fulfill its natural end, and providing the material, social, and cultural basis to allow them to do so. Hence, the purpose of any science in this period, including economic science, was to humanize the natural world, to better advance the goals of building up the human person, the family, and the various communities, village, state, city, state, and nation, which constitute the human family. But in the modern world, the metaphor has shifted from the organic to the mechanical. Being was just a machine, and God, if he exists at all, is just the chief engineer, architect, and mechanic. Even life itself was no more than a particular arrangement of atoms, and consciousness no more than a certain structure, say a cerebral cortex, that gave the illusion of awareness, thought, and feelings. Even love could be reduced to chemistry. In this mechanical world, all forms are accidental rather than natural. Everything could be otherwise than it is and may be remade into any convenient form. In this context, the idea of dominion shifted from that of a father to that of a tyrant, one capable of exploiting nature for private or public gain. There are no natural limits that this tyrant, man, cannot overcome. The exploitation of nature is carried out in the context of the survival of the fittest and the war of all against all, upon which this survival is thought to depend. This philosophy isolated the human person and reduced him to the individual, with families and communities reduced to an epiphenomenon of individual transactions, with each transaction having personal gain as its sole end. The task of politics and culture now shifted to appropriating the methods of this universal machine and exploiting it to our advantage. Now, this march toward modernism actually began with the scholastics. Thomas Aquinas and his colleagues had tremendous confidence in the ability of the human intellect to comprehend the world. But Aquinas made a fatal move, one that seemed innocent enough at the time, but would have far-reaching consequences. He asserted that, quote, the same thing cannot be both seen and believed, unquote. And he concluded by saying that, quote, hence it follows that the same thing cannot be an object of both faith and science, end quote. In other words, he separated faith and science and made science the superior of faith. Of course, Thomas was talking about mundane matters and took the faith for granted. But he did assert that the world could be understood quite apart from religion. This set off a quest to comprehend the world by unaided reason alone, and hence apart from the great chain of being. So, it is little wonder that Francis Bacon would imagine a world free of religious influence, where a steady gaze at nature alone would reveal all truth, and the priests and bishops would be scientific sages. In the next generation, René Descartes could imagine the world as a vast machine, and space as flat, uniform, and invariant, and which presented no problem that could not be solved with coordinate geometry. The organic model was dissolving. Now, Descartes did not imagine that he was raising any challenge to the Catholic faith or the Christian religion. Quite the contrary. But he opened up a space in which a desacralized vision of the world could flourish. The real success of the Cartesian vision came in the 18th century with Isaac Newton. The ancient astronomers had more or less accurately mapped the movements of the heavens, but they could not provide any explanation of these movements. But Newton, with a few simple formulas operating in a flat Cartesian space, had solved problems that plagued science for at least 3,000 years. The effect was electrifying. The English Catholic poet Alexander Pope, reflecting the common opinion, wrote, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." The success of Newton's physics set off a search for similar Newtonian principles to guide every other science, even or especially the sciences of politics and economics. Somehow, the markets had to be guided by a simple, fundamental law. If it worked for the complex motions of the stars, surely there must be a similar principle for all the motions of the markets. As the 19th century economist William Jevons put it, all we needed were better statistics. Once the statistics had been gathered, the generalization of laws from them, quote, will render economics a science as exact as many of the physical sciences, end quote. But the markets proved somewhat resistant to this new model. There didn't seem to be a simple formula, a Newtonian principle to govern the movement of the markets, and Jevons' exact system of statistics seemed out of reach. People still spoke only of political economy, meaning that the market was fully inscribed within the political and ethical orders, as it had been since the time of Aristotle. And it could not be understood apart from those orders. Then, in 1891, things changed. A.E. Marshall published his Principles of Economics. It is noteworthy that this is the first use of the term economics in the current sense. Indeed, the term was so new that Marshall had to explain what he meant by it in the very first sentence. Marshall's Newtonian principle was to reduce all things economic, and especially land and labor, to elements of the capital fund, which should be purchased at the lowest possible price, a price which could then be plotted in a neutral Cartesian space to produce those ubiquitous supply and demand charts that decorate all of our economic texts, and which purport to reduce all the movements of the market to neat, straight lines. In much the same way, Newton's charts explained the motions of the heavens, economics now had its Newtonian principle. Marshall's theory might have established economics as a physical science, but it bore little relation to the physical world and resulted in any number of absurdities. It would be a day-long task to point out all these absurdities, so I will concentrate on just two: the mathematical absurdity and the absurdity of commodified labor. Marshall's primary error was to imagine supply and demand as independent variables which could be solved with linear equations, the kind of equations that produce those neat straight lines that we are accustomed to seeing in the textbooks. But they are not independent variables. They are codependent. Supply and demand represent the division of rewards between suppliers, mostly firms, and demanders, mostly workers. So, for example, a division which gives the suppliers a larger proportion of the rewards will result in one demand curve, while a division that gives the bulk to the workers will produce another demand curve. And since we are dealing with physical quantities, it is zero-sum and codependent. Codependent variables cannot be solved with linear equations. Their solutions require differential equations, and such equations do not yield those neat, straight lines. Rather, they yield charts of enormous complexity, where supply and demand rotate around attractor points but never quite reach them, and result in wild and unexpected swings. It is not hard to judge which set of charts more accurately describes the economies that we actually see. But the great irony in Marshall's charts is that they assume a well-distributed production system, a system where every product is produced by a vast number of firms such that no firm has any pricing power. They are all price takers rather than price makers. In other words, Marshall's system would only work in an economy of well-distributed property. Alas, that is not the economy we have now, and wasn't even true in Marshall's day. In the United States, nearly every market sector, from beer to banking, from eyeglasses to entertainment, is dominated by a few vast corporate collectives, with from 2 to 5 firms controlling 80% of any given market sector and always acting together as a cartel to set prices. For example, we go into the grocery store and we see dozens of brands of breakfast cereals and we think, the free market at work. But in truth, there are only two companies behind the varied boxes, Kellogg's and Post. Even the private label brands are made in one of their factories and just put into different boxes. So, the great irony is that Marshall's free market capitalism would work only in a distributist economy. But as for the actually existing capitalism, it has collectivized the economy beyond the dreams of any Stalinist bureaucrat. Or as Chesterton put it, capitalism and communism are very much alike, especially capitalism. The mathematical error is serious enough, but Marshall made an even more basic error. He treated labor as just another commodity to be purchased at the lowest possible price. But labor is also required to purchase the bulk of goods offered for sale. In other words, one commodity, priced as a commodity, is supposed to purchase all the other commodities. This is simply not possible. Again, G.K. Chesterton spotted the error from the first. Quote, capitalism is contradictory as soon as it is complete, because it is dealing with the mass of men in two opposite ways at once. When most men are wage earners, it is more and more difficult for most men to be customers. For the capitalist is always trying to cut down what his servant demands, and in doing so is cutting down what his customer can spend. He is wanting the same man to be rich and poor at the same time. The inability of commodified labor to absorb all the output explains another perplexing aspect of capitalist systems. They purport to believe in limited government, but the historical reality is that big capitalism and big government grow together, the one feeding off the other. This is not a matter of ideology, but of necessity. If commodified labor cannot absorb all the output, the economy requires a consumer of last resort, one capable of clearing the markets that cannot, even in principle, be cleared by commodified labor. Government has always fulfilled this role. Big government filled the role that commodified consumer cannot possibly fill. Indeed, the heyday of free market capitalism, which in England began with the victory of the Liberal Party, we would say Libertarian Party, in 1832, and in the United States with the victory of the Republican Party in 1860. And these conditions lasted until 1929. In this period, the business cycle, from boom to bust, averaged only 3.8 years. That is to say, it was a time of chaos for both capital and labor and posed a problem which could only be solved either by the overthrow of capitalism or by the growth of government. Within the limits of liberalism, there really is no third choice. Without this gargantuan consumer, capitalism is incapable of clearing its own markets. I could continue this discourse on the absurdities of capitalism for the rest of the day, but in the interests of time, allow me to summarize them. Capitalism claims to be a free market system, but it has destroyed the freedom of most markets. It claims to be a system of limited government, but has led to the unprecedented expansion of government. It claims to be a system of private property, but most productive property is gathered into vast corporate collectives. It claims to be a system of efficiency, but its success is measured by the height of its garbage dumps, the visible sign of inefficiency. It claims to liberate the individual, but has only made him more dependent upon big government and big business. It claims to be a pure science, but its formulations bear little resemblance to the real world. In short, capitalism claims the mantles of free markets and limited government, but destroys the first and grows the second to gargantuan proportions. I would like now to return to the question of the challenges to the modernist ideologies. For just as they achieved their apogee in Cartesian space and Newtonian mechanics, so it was in the fields of astronomy and physics that this worldview began to collapse and its metaphors no longer held. At the end of the 19th century, Lord Kelvin, one of the leading physicists of his day, declared that only two small problems remained for physics to be complete: the problem of black box radiation and the search for the luminiferous ether. Alas, rather than completing physics, the solution to these problems opened up whole new models of how the world works. In space of flat space and simple mechanics of Newton and Descartes, we entered a world of relativity, uncertainty, curved space, and the quantum. Now, I will not pretend to be an expert on quantum mechanics, but this much I can say. The very name quantum mechanics is ironic, since the system is anything but mechanical, at least not in the Newtonian sense. Each new advance seems only to open up new marvels, so that the universe is once again becoming marvelous. It is almost as if the great chain of being is being restored. And if this chain does not as yet lead directly to God, at least it leads to a situation where God is as good an explanation as any on offer. Newton may have brought light to physics, but it turns out that both light and physics are something entirely different from what the Newtonians thought they were. It is, I think, no accident that Chesterton and Belloc were raising their challenges to the accepted system at the same time that Albert Einstein and Max Planck were raising theirs. Cultural challenges frequently emerge from different directions at once, and the reasons for doubting the scientific pretensions of liberalism began to grow after the long recession of 1873, which formally lasted until 1879, but actually continued on and off until the Great Depression of 1920. Indeed, in the 20th century, communism, fascism, and Nazism were all failed attempts to soften capitalism and bring the economy under state control. But it was often difficult to tell just who was controlling whom. And after the war, Western Europe reached a kind of economic truce by establishing social democracies, a flawed but functioning compromise. But the challenges to modernism came not only in the scientific and economic realms, but from art, literature, theology, and philosophy. Philosophers as diverse as Alistair MacIntyre and Slavoj Žižek are bringing modernist assumptions into question in a broad-based movement called postmodernism. What else? Now, it doesn't really matter if one agrees or disagrees with any particular flavor of this movement. The point is that dissent from modernism is becoming more and more the rule rather than the exception. But one challenge in particular I would like to highlight is the one raised by Catholic social teaching, and that is the challenge to individualism itself. This challenge has a name, personalism, and that name highlights the great modern delusion. Under liberalism, we are all self-interested atoms whose interactions aim only at our personal advantage and produce the illusion of society and social order. Or as Margaret Thatcher put it, speaking for the liberals, there is no such thing as society. But personalism recognizes the obvious fact that all of us have two things: a family name and a native language. That is to say, we all emerge not only from the womb of the mother, but from the womb of the family, and could not survive a day without that womb. And we all receive a rich cultural inheritance that makes us what we are. And we received these things: being, language, culture. We received them as pure gifts. We exchanged nothing for them. That is to say, culture and society are prior to the individual. In the modernist philosophies, the individual seeks only his own advantage in isolation from others. But in personalism, the human person seeks his own development within the common good and in community with others. And each of these philosophies results not only in a different conception of social order, but in a different conception of business organization as well. A new conception that is now gaining ground. In the middle of the 20th century, it was evident to all that capitalism could not survive in its pure form. The wars and economic instability were proof enough of that. So, the effort to save capitalism from itself came in the form of redistributing income through various means, such as increasing the bargaining power of labor through unionization, raising the minimum wage, redistributing the output through welfare, and through making certain goods like healthcare resemble common goods available freely or at low cost to all. But as praiseworthy as all of these efforts are, they do not get to the root of the problem. They ameliorate capitalism, but leave it intact with all its flaws. This is because they do not address the basic question, the question of property. As long as property is gathered into vast corporate collectives, capitalism can only be that which it is. And the state will be just another vast collective, but one that we are all forced to join. But the cultural challenge is now resulting in both a managerial revolution and an ownership revolution. More and more, the ideas of shared ownership and control are becoming part of management practice. That is to say, distributism itself is moving to the heart of management and business theory and practice. Few of the practitioners, I suspect, are aware of the pioneering work of Chesterton and Belloc, and all would be surprised to find that the distributists got there first. This is understandable, since the distributism of the Chester Belloc was often regarded as mere agrarian nostalgia, a mere 3 acres and a cow romanticism. But in fact, the most important victories and exemplars of distributism are in the industrial sector. We think of the Mondragon cooperatives of Spain or the cooperative economies of Emilia-Romagna in Italy. But the ideas they pioneered are now moving to the heart of management science and doing so worldwide. In the United States, we have many enterprises like the Springfield Remanufacturing Corporation. Its founder, Jack Stack, has written A Stake in the Outcome, which is kind of a textbook for practical distributism. Likewise, in Brazil, we find Ricardo Semler, who inherited a small company called Semco and turned it into a flourishing conglomerate through the practice of employee control and profit sharing. His book, The 7-Day Weekend, could be considered a manual for the practice of distributism. Frederic Laloux of France has written Reinventing Organizations, which document the rise of employee ownership and control across a large number of mostly European enterprises. I think, in this regard, we distributists who have not already done so need to become familiar with this growing body of literature. There is a long list of them, but I suspect most distributists are unaware of just how successful their theories are. I think it is fair to say that we have practiced a certain degree of self-isolation. It is time, I believe, to join those wider movements, because we still have something to offer, which most of these authors have not yet grasped. One of the problems comes in the very name, distributism, which sounds vaguely socialist to many people. And in one sense, it is. In fact, it socializes property more effectively than socialism, which merely collectivizes it. But that raised fears in some people who are worried about their own property. Indeed, the American Chesterton Society itself has dropped the name distributism entirely and replaced it with the term localism. But I think this is a big mistake. Localizing government without distributing property will mean that the local is powerless in the face of vast concentrations of economic power. Whatever one thinks of the proper size of government, it needs to be at least as large as the largest economic power, or it will be subservient to that power. I think we can imitate the strategy of the capitalists by a more conscious association of distributism with free markets and small government. After all, we can honestly do this, which the capitalists certainly cannot. Indeed, neoclassical economics, the economics of Marshall and his descendants, can only work when property is well distributed, and the radical distinctions between workers and owners are lessened or eliminated. Then the division of rewards between suppliers and demanders, the division upon which the supply and demand charts depend, find their natural and stable solution. And neoclassical economics becomes a useful, if incomplete, description of economic order. But beyond this, there is an element which distributism adds to the new theories and practices, and one that is crucial. What is that element? In my opinion, it is that these movements pay little attention to the family and the community. For one serious effect of capitalism, and arguably its most damaging, is that the family has become a secondary consideration, if it is considered at all. Indeed, under capitalism, the family is little more than just another consumer item. Great for those who like that product, but certainly not central to civilization and culture. Of course, the opposite is true. Nations need strong communities, and strong communities need strong families. And both need a secure economic base in order to survive at all. I think this is the crucial element which we add, and we are in a unique position to be able to accomplish this task. Capitalism marginalized the family, and it is up to the distributists to join with like-minded people to move the family back to the center of social and economic life. Thank you very much.
So, John, early in your talk, you mentioned that communism, fascism, and Nazism are all extensions of liberalism. Can you expand on that and kind of, I think a lot of us, when we hear those terms, I mean, they're very loaded, obviously, and we think of them as being very, very different things. So can you kind of paint for us a picture of what the commonality is there? How are those related to liberalism, and how do all three of those kind of spin out of that common philosophy?
Well, fascism and its younger brother Nazism were both have that at their economic core a philosophy called associationalism. And associationalism was the idea that the large companies in any market sector should get together, okay, supposedly in cooperation with the workers in that sector. And they should be able to set prices, set production, do things like that. That was associationalism, was the philosophy of both, oddly enough, Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt. And that was the foundation of the New Deal. So it was just an extremely popular idea at the time. After the war, then under Eisenhower, it was extended to agriculture. And agriculture was supposed to join this associationalist scheme. And the phrase was, and I think it was William Taft Benson, if I'm remembering correctly, who was the Secretary of Agriculture. He said to the farmers, get big or get out. Okay, and that's when we began to get these factory farms. That was a deliberate government policy. And so associationalism, fascism, communism were on the economic level. Now, there's a lot of other things, of course, where there were bitter enemies, but on the economic level, there were very, very related theories, almost the same theory, in fact. Communism was just capitalism, but instead of having share owners own all the corporations, you had government bureaucrats owning the corporations. They owned it in the name of the people, under the dictatorship of the proletariat. But the first job of the dictatorship of the bureaucracy under the dictatorship of the proletariat was to ensure that the proletariat never got anywhere near the dictator. Okay, so but all of them had this big collectivizing interest at heart, because they really, really believed that was the key to economic efficiency. And for them, small was not beautiful, small was ugly, small was inefficient. Which, by the way, just the opposite is true.
So on that note, we do have a question from one of our YouTube viewers. Is it possible to achieve massive amounts of wealth with this distributism model?
I hope not. I think it certainly works against massive accumulations of wealth. Now, I'm talking about individual wealth. If you're talking about social wealth, I think, yeah, it's very possible to produce a very wealthy society. But so it depends on what we're talking here. If we're talking about individuals getting, Elon Musk rich, I don't think that's possible under distributism. If it's a matter of making as many people as possible comfortable, having a good life, that is, and having a very good life. Yes, I think that is not only is more than possible, we can look at practical examples, as in Mondragon, as in Emilia-Romagna, as in the co-determination of Germany and Western Europe in general. So yes, we can create wealthy societies this way.
So I think we should back up a little bit. We did get the question on X, formerly known as Twitter. What is distributism? So I know distributism is in the title of the talk here, and but I don't think we explicitly gave a kind of concise definition. So can you just kind of give us a high-level overview for our viewers who might be a little bit confused about what we're talking about?
Yes, distributism calls for the wider distribution of productive property. So it is the opposite of collectivism, which collectivizes property. And collectivism, whether capitalist or socialist, collectivizes property into large collectives. What else can I call them? Run either by the state bureaucracies or by a professional manager. Well, in both cases, by a professional managerial class. Distributism is as many people as possible owning their own property and managing that property.
Okay. And we had a question earlier. Let me go find it here in the chat. So I am not familiar exactly with all of the terms that this person cited, but I hope you will be. So they say that they believe the goal is to support a corporatist but not fascist government like the Estado Novo of Portugal. I hope that's something you're familiar with. If this isn't true, what is the difference?
Yes, I have looked a little bit. If she's talking about Salazar program, it had fascist elements, and it was very, very corporatist. But no, it is not corporatist in that way. Now, people like Mondragon is very, very well, it's third largest corporation in, I think, in all of northern Spain. But it's not corporatist at all because all of the entities are separate cooperatives and can leave the Mondragon cooperative and have left. Some have left the Mondragon cooperative and set up on their own. So in that sense, you would have a situation where, if you get a large company like GE with its many, many divisions, well, the distributist model would be any one of those divisions could leave GE and set up its own company. So it's almost gathering together in a corporation like Mondragon is a tool, but it's not the end. It's not the end point. It's the means, not the end. And when it no longer fulfills its ends, the cooperatives can leave. So insofar as it is corporatist, when it is only so accidentally. It's not the point of the system. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Our next question is, do you think a land value tax could help lead to distributism since it makes it harder to hoard community-derived wealth?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think there needs to be a greater dialogue between the Georgists and the distributists. The land value tax is certainly a defensible and useful theory. I think some are worried, well, if you get land value tax, it could work against distributism. I don't think that's true. I think just the opposite. I think it certainly in land, it certainly prevents accumulation. See what we're seeing today, accumulations of residential and farmland in the hands of larger and larger corporations through the real estate investment trusts. I think the land value tax would break up those REITs very, very quickly and make everything better for everybody. So yeah, that's a dialogue which really needs to take place.
So speaking of REITs and loans and all of that, Laura on Facebook asks, what do you think Chesterton would have to say today regarding our current reserve system of central banking?
Alas, I don't think he would have much to say because I don't think he knew much about money. They never addressed the question of money. Belloc does it briefly in Economics for Helen, I think. But I don't think they had they sort of accepted money as whatever the system was as existing. I don't think they really understood fractional reserve banking. To the best of my knowledge, neither of them ever addresses that question.
Okay. Brad on YouTube asks, at this point, how do we move away from the factory farm model without disrupting food production?
No, I don't want to pretend to have any more expertise in farm economics than I do. But my suspicion is it's just the opposite. It will improve food production. It will shorten supply lines. It will shorten processing times. Of course, you have to get away from the supermarket and move and work at both ends of the system, both at the farm and at the retail outlet. But maybe the land value tax would be one means of doing that. Certainly ending subsidies, or let's say reviewing subsidies, would do that, would help in that. But again, that's and certainly limiting the amount of property a real estate investment trust or any one owner could buy would help with that. So there are farms which are actually trying to de-mechanize and being extremely successful at it. The factory farm led almost to its opposite. So I was just listening to something the other day, a farmer who has to borrow $5 million a year because these big farms are so capital intensive. But the buyers for their products are only a few. So Archer's Daniels Midlands is one. What's the other one? I forget. I can't remember the other big buyer for them. Since there's only a few buyers, basically these big factory farms are enslaved to Archer Daniels Midlands or to Purdue if they're chicken farmers, or I think Purdue is also the biggest pork supplier, but I could be wrong about that. But they all go through these processors, and it's the processors now who hold the power, not the farmer. The processor distributor who holds the power in those markets and has the factory farm has become practically the sharecroppers of the food system. Sharecroppers with very expensive machinery, but sharecroppers nonetheless.
Yeah, and if any of our viewers are interested in the issue of like regenerative farming, check out the book "A Bold Return to Giving a Damn" by Will Harris. That is an excellent book by a 6th generation cattle rancher. So, all right. So we had talked earlier about the ability to accumulate wealth within a distributist model. The viewer who asked that sent a follow-up and says that part of the reason people are so bought into capitalism is that theoretically we can all work hard to achieve that level of wealth. How then will you convince people to participate in your model?
Well, if the object is to achieve Elon Musk levels of wealth, my first warning is to say, do you really want to be like Elon Musk? Um, and the second is, what's the point of having all that wealth? I mean, I doubt if it will. I doubt if it brings anybody happiness. Elon doesn't seem to be that happy. We are so focused on wealth as the measure of man. I think it's sort of a desacralized Calvinism, and I'm not attacking Calvinism here, but a desacralized Calvinism, where salvation is money, even though the money has no natural purpose or end, or we just have to sort of culturally redefine ourselves to get away from that. That's less of an economic question than it is a spiritual, a cultural, a social question. So it is true. I think somebody said that people accept capitalism because they all see themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, rather than as workers, but it may promise you high levels of wealth, but it obviously can only deliver that promise for a very, very few people.
Yeah, I believe that was Upton Sinclair that said that.
No, he had another comment.
Oh, I think maybe it was John Steinbeck. I knew that had that quote, but
I know the quote you're talking about. Yes, okay, yes. No, I did steal that from one of those two gentlemen, and I forgot. Like you, I've forgotten which one I stole
yeah,
it from. That's the problem with being an intellectual thief. You do it so often you forget where you've been.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next question comes from Bonnie. Is there any modern day example of a community or larger government implementing a distributist model?
Yes, there are. Of course, Mondragon, which is a big force in the Basque area of Spain. And then the Emilia-Romagna models, which the Emilia-Romagna cooperatives provide about 40% of the GDP of that area around Bologna, which is called Emilia-Romagna. So that's, and now these are models. Well, the Emilia-Romagna model is actually probably about 150 years old, although Mussolini dismantled them. They were recreated after the war. Mondragon dates back to the mid 50s. So that's a long enough history to be considered a good test, I think. Of a government being a distributist, well, modern governments, I can't think of a government model offhand, but perhaps somebody else can.
So our Georgia.
No, let me take that back.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
In a sense, the EU is trying to do something like that with their models of co-determination. Okay, they're trying to introduce more distributed control of the corporation. So in the EU, large corporations, 50% of the board of directors are appointed by the workers. And in smaller corporations, a third of the directors are appointed by the workers. Now, this is a real move towards worker influence in the management of the corporation, which is certainly distributist. And then they have social councils or works councils to kind of iron out issues on the factory floor and in the office and that sort of thing. So, yeah, there's distributist influence in the EU for sure.
So our Georgist friend chimes in and says, as a reminder, the land value tax is separate from property tax, and that it only taxes land and not things built on it. Can you talk?
It doesn't tax labor or capital, estimates that I've seen, it's really hard to figure out how much an LVT would raise. Estimates I've seen are about 20%. So the federal government absorbs about 18% in taxes. So at the federal level, they'd be about equal. I think it would, my gut feeling, and it's just a gut feeling, it's not a calculation, is that the LVT could replace both state and local taxes, but you'd still need the FICA taxes, the wealth transfer taxes, like Social Security, Medicare, and all of that. That problem is solved, however, by just simply removing the $160,000 limit on FICA taxes and taxing capital income at the same rate you tax labor income. Right now, capital income is taxed much, much lower than labor income. So if you read the tax code, working is a sin, which ought to be discouraged, whereas investing is virtuous. It's my understanding. Perhaps Descriptor probably has more knowledge of this than I do.
So that is the last question that I see from the audience. So before we go, I do want to just throw this comment up here. There is a book recommendation. So if you're interested in the topic of land value tax and Georgism, check that book out. And I want to thank you, John, for joining us tonight and sharing your expertise with us. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in. We will have a keynote speech in about 28 minutes from one of our candidates. And then we have a full schedule of events starting at 4 p.m. Eastern through 10 p.m. Eastern tomorrow and Sunday. So make sure that you stay tuned to our social media channels for those. And we hope you have a good night. And John, thank you again. We really appreciate you joining us.
And thank you. I really do appreciate your attention.